Okay, I'm now going to call on Clara Berglund, please.
Thank you so much, and so impressive to hear your Swedish as well. I'll see if I can share my PowerPoint. This. So just like described, I will talk about how different forces come together to threaten women's rights. And I will give you just a quick descriptions with some examples, but this is a longer, much longer talk, and I think it will be an inspiration, and you can think about it in your own context. So this is why the Irish women's lobby is so greatly needed. It's needed because women and girls are in danger, and there is a war going on against us, and our rights are under attack. And beware that it's a two-front war. So the first front, you have probably heard about it. It's the anti-gender movement. And in Sweden and many other countries, we have progressive politicians and activists that are coming together to fight the conservative and far-right backlash against women's rights. And the background to this is something like this. Throughout the history, we have seen that the Holy See and the Vatican, they have worked very hard to limit the freedom of women and girls. But in the 19th, they changed the strategy and launched a wider campaign against what they call gender ideology. And they focused particularly on questioning gender studies and limiting women's sexual and reproductive rights, such as the right to abortion and such as the right to sexuality education, etc. Soon after that, other conservative religious movements joined this new anti-gender movement. And in the last decade, we've also seen that growing populist and far right-wing movements in Europe and North America have also come aboard. And together they have been remarkably successful. The methods that they use are very strategic. For example, they work to establish new language. They create new NGOs with nice names about dignity and rights, etc. And they pursue legal disputes, both nationally and internationally. Here are just two examples. So an important part of the strategy is to limit and control actors that are promoting sexual and reproductive rights, such as, for example, Planned Parenthood. So the new gag rule that was introduced by Donald Trump is a perfect example of this, restricting all funds to Planned Parenthood and other organizations that offer abortion services and other sexual and reproductive services. The anti-gender movement is gaining ground around the world, but it has a stronghold in several Eastern European countries, such as Hungary and Poland. So, for example, the Orban administration in Hungary has banned gender studies from all universities. But at the same time, the women's rights are also under attack from what I call the pro-gender movement. Or should I maybe call it the anti-women movement? This front of the war is not nearly as known, and we can see that many progressive politicians and even feminists and other activists, they are so eager to position themselves against the anti-gender movement that they actually end up inside the enemy lines without even noticing. And the background to this front is that it all started in the 80s and 90s. We had a neoliberal wave that swept over the world. And Margaret Thatcher said that there is no such thing as a society, only individual men and women. And soon after that, other countries followed in her steps. And even in Sweden, the Social Democrats introduced deregulation, privatization, and big austerity measures. This meant that left-wing politics, as we've known it before, were out of fashion, and the feminist movement was very divided. And some fractions of left-wing politicians and feminists, they turned to postmodern theories about identities. And this meant that they forgot about women and the working class and oppression. And this shift made it possible for them to survive in this new neoliberal, hyper-individualistic era. In fact, it made it possible for a new anti-women agenda to take form. And this agenda focused on defending, but also reframing sexual and reproductive rights. It wasn't women's sexual rights anymore, it was everyone's sexual rights. And rights were not universal. Instead, every person seemed to be free to define his or her own rights without having to worry about the oppression of women as a class. It's very clear that the anti-women or the pro-gender movement, they use a feminist terminology, but they fill it with neoliberal and postmodern ideology. For example, women's right to decide over their own bodies has been reframed as the right to sell your body on a market. In fact, all rights can be bought and sold in the market in a neoliberal world. The pro-gender movement is very influential here in Sweden and also in many other European countries, as well as North America. And interestingly, they seem to use much of the same methods as the anti-gender movement. They create new and infiltrate existing NGOs. They try to control funding streams. And to do that, they have help from a few very influential billionaires that make strategic donations. But they also use no platforming, name calling, and they especially try to recruit young feminists. And they are very active and very organized on all social media platforms, building on the polarization that already exists within those forums. And I have so many examples of how the pro-gender movement has, with all the resources that they have at their disposal, have infiltrated and turned big organizations and movements. I think this image of a girl taking part in a climate protest says it all. Her sign says, "Destroy my pussy, not the planet." And I think perhaps that Gail Dines or other speakers in the panels as well can testify to where this message comes from, possibly from the porn industry. And also, by the way, did you know that the Black Lives Matter movement wants to decriminalize the sex industry? It's not a coincidence. The other image is an advertisement for surrogacy motherhood. And you can see how they use the feminist discourse. Being a surrogate mother can be empowering for women. Really, to go for the physical and emotional trauma of pregnancy and birth, and then to give up the child that you have carried inside you for 9 months is supposed to be empowering. It sounds exactly like the opposite of empowerment to me. So I have briefly described the growing anti-gender movement, how conservative, religious, populist, nationalist forces have come together to push women's rights backwards. But I've also made clear that the identity politics and the neoliberal ideology of the pro-gender movement doesn't have women's back either. But luckily, there's a third option. The pro-women movement is an opposition both to the anti-gender movement and the pro-gender movement. And us, I call it us because I believe that the Irish Women's Lobby will join us in this position. We have never forgotten that women are oppressed as a class. We believe that human rights are universal and not up for interpretation. And we call on reforms that can improve the everyday lives of women and girls. And lastly, I just want to show you how the pro and anti-gender movement, as well as the pro-women's movement, views a few important feminist issues. So first of all, the pro-women movement, we have a holistic view of the body, as in you are your body, while the pro-gender movement has a deconstructive view of the body, as in the body can be separated from the self. And the anti-gender movement believes that the body is sacred or dirty, and it practices virginity and honor standards. When it comes to men's violence against women, in the pro-women movement, we believe it's important to recognize this violence is gendered and that it requires structural understanding and political solutions. While in the pro-gender movement, this is described as intimate partner violence with can be solved with individual solutions. And in the anti-gender movement, they call this domestic violence, which should be solved inside the family. When it comes to prostitution, we want to abolish prostitution and to criminalize sex purchase. We believe that women in prostitution are survivors and also victims of a crime. In the pro-gender movement, they want to decriminalize this entire sex industry. They think that women in prostitution are sex workers and entrepreneurs. The anti-gender movement want to criminalize prostitution, with the argument coming from the Madonna whore complex. The pro-gender movement, the pro-women movement wants to abolish surrogacy, much for the same reasons as prostitution. We believe that it is trafficking in women and children. But the pro-gender movement want to legalize what they call pregnancy hosting, which means that women make money and childless people can have children, simple as that. And the anti-gender movement, they want to criminalize surrogacy, but for other reasons, because they feel motherhood and life are sacred. In the pro-gender movement, we believe in biological sex and sex-based rights as they are defined in CEDAW, and that women are discriminated against because of the role that we have in reproduction. In the pro-gender movement, they talk instead about gender and identity, and that gender is fluid and a spectrum, etc. And in the anti-gender movement, they have an essentialist view of sex and gender, meaning that gender can never be liberated from sex, which is what we are trying to achieve in the pro-women's movement. So this is just a very simple way of describing those different ideological standpoints that we have in those different positions that we have identified when we have tried to map this war against women that we are seeing around us. And I think that perhaps many of you recognize this picture as well. And I so much again want to welcome the Irish Women's Lobby to this struggle, and I hope that we can fight it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. I mean, that's fascinating information there. I think very useful matrix and analytical framework. I'm sure a lot of the people who are watching will now be able to see where they would plot themselves looking at it in that way. So that's great. And it prompts me just to respond to a couple of the questions that come up a couple of times in the chat, where people have been asking, are the presentations that are made, will they be available? And so I think some people will certainly be able to make their presentations available, and those who do, we will put them on the website and make them available afterwards. So any of our panelists who are willing to share their slides of that, and we can put them on the website. There was another question asking whether or not we are going to if the videos will be available after the event. And just to clarify, yes, that we will be putting this on YouTube, and I think they will be edited down into individual videos as well as the entirety. So I hope that answers some of the questions in the chat. Thanks once again, Clara, and great work.